good behavior, and he says, what right do you have to say that this is wrong and I'm right? The best answer to give him is, because I know that I'm right, and I really don't care what source you have. Because the fact that the guy pulls down some source and claims that it justifies an action, like an assassination, or even beating someone up, or who knows what, I don't care if the guy goes up and pushes the chazan off the biva because he thinks he's singing the wrong melody or something like that, right? The fact of the matter is that we all have to stand up and we have to say, well, you can call anything you want. We know that the way of Judaism is the way of peace and not the way of fanaticism. And we have to, the fact that he could take sources and quote them in a certain way, it's not relevant. And that's something that happens very often, and I think we have to be willing to understand that that's not our way. Now, the final point that I want to make is that often we ask ourselves, what can we do about something? And the truth of the matter is we can't do about some crazy guy who goes over at some kid and spits on him in Israel or something like that, or any other place. We can't do anything about that, but we can do things about our own behavior. So what I just say as a final point, that we have to think all the time as we go on, realizing that we have to make sure that we're behaving with piety and not fanaticism in the things that we're doing them. And we should strive to encourage among ourselves and our friends and our families greater piety, but we should always make sure that the way we understand what we're doing does not in any way imply hatred for others and disdain for others, and that it should be a pious action and not one of fanaticism. Thank you very much. I guess we have questions. Okay, so we'll take questions. Apparently you're going to be able to see this on YouTube. I don't know if... yeah.
Could you comment on the recent Israeli Supreme Court?
Oh,
Since
boy.
Apparently the law was only put in place
a few years ago.
In the century.
Century, yeah. It's just a few years ago.
Right.
Let me explain. The question is, could I comment about basically the overturning by the Supreme Court of the Tal law?
One more comment.
I got to remember all this.
After hearing your talk, I would thank God that there's not a temple in Israel now, or it would be destroyed.
Oh, that's an interesting line. Okay, so let me get to the Tal law. The Tal law was an attempt, one of the attempts by Israel to solve the problem of people who cannot go into the workforce because if you didn't serve in the army, you're not allowed to work. That is the law in Israel. So the idea was that they would have a situation where yeshiva students could transition to the workforce without serving in the army. But in a certain sense, this was going from the army deferment, taking away the only punishment, you might call it, from the deferment. But the idea was if the guy's not going to serve in the army anyhow, what do we need to have a situation in which this guy can't earn a living and we have to pay for him for the rest of his life, and he's not a contributor to the economy? So you have to know that this all started because of a discussion by some economists about the problem that there's a tremendous loss of productivity in Israel for having so many people not in the workforce. And the number of people not in the workforce is growing. And so what they decided was that they would give this opportunity to enter the workforce even without army service. So it was now overturned. By the way, just in parenthesis, there were some other things overturned by accident with the same law, but so the law is they're going to have to come with some new laws. But the problem is that simultaneous with this, while this is going on, other solutions have been put into effect by the army. The army has increased the number of so-called charedim that it recruits, and it's also provided special job training opportunities for them by going specifically into non-combat units with technical education. Now, believe it or not, there seem to be some pretty clever people in the army who understand that because of the force, the political and other force of the army, they can do a lot of good in this situation. But on the other hand, having said this, now you have the fanatics coming along and talking about how the state is anti-Torah and they're trying to stop us from Torah study and all this kind of stuff. But in the end, what will happen in Israel is that the political parties will bow as usual, somehow or another, to the religious groups. But here's something which you have to understand. The Tal law was, believe it or not favored by the more right-wing yeshiva types, because the Tal law lets people leave yeshiva, go to the workforce. And believe it or not, some of these guys think that working is a bad thing. Another new Jewish idea that was invented just recently, right? If anyone thinks Judaism doesn't change, boy, they're wrong. I mean, look at the invention of the idea that you're not allowed to work, right? And actually, I have to tell you, this is not a joke. There's a synagogue that my son sometimes goes to in Israel, which it's called Charedim Ovdim. Haredim will work. They can't go to regular Haredi synagogue because they don't want you there if you work. It's not a joke. Not you laughing about it, it's not funny. Yeah, Stan.
What is the relationship of the Rebbeim
The relationship of the Rebbeim and these fanatics to what they're doing. I have to say I don't know. I can tell you that the one who really stood up against this in fully, the Belzer Rebbe, he spoke against it fully. There's very little condemnation by some of the rabbis, but you see, my feeling about this is that the real extremists don't belong to any of the groups whose rabbis you want to hear condemn it. And the rabbis of the people who are doing it probably believe in it. I mean, because what we're talking about, what are we talking about here? Let's just keep this in mind, right? You have one individual spat on one kid, and you have a few episodes of people pushing people around on buses. Now, most of what you have is rather an attempt to have segregated seating on public buses by voluntary behavior. Meaning, it's in a religious neighborhood, the men sit in the front, the women sit in the back, and everybody's happy. A few couples sit together. Now, that activity, the rabbis of those people all think is right. But no one came and asked them, what do I do? Should I beat up a woman or something? They say, no, of course not. You see my point? But they're not the ones that you're talking about. You have to be very careful. The crazies in Beit Shemesh, you must understand, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls sect left Jerusalem to go to the desert, the guys in Beit Shemesh had to leave Yerushalayim, they had to leave the area of Mea Sharim because it wasn't religious enough for them. You see what kind of people you're talking about? Total extremists. And my point is that I would assume that their leaders think they're doing the right thing. Yeah, Harvey?
From that perspective, inside the medical
Yeah.
and their rebellion, how do they reconcile violating this halakha in support of that?
Okay, this is the question. How do I set aside one halakha for another one? So you should excuse me. The same question applies to fanatics in the more modern groups who are what I would call land fanatics, who do things like going to an army base. How do you reconcile going to an army base, attacking an army base? God forbid somebody would have been killed, right? Okay, now, I want to just tell you one thing. This is a problem throughout Jewish history. That how do you know you're a fanatic? You know you're a fanatic when you have to violate halakha to do what you're doing. It's very simple. But they don't have to, we call reconcile. I can't ask them and know. But what I can tell you is this. There is a suspension of belief, you might call it, of rationality that occurs when you are a fanatic. That's what fanatic is. So that's the same thing as the example I gave. The guy's fanatic when he wants to have clean clothes, so he beats up his wife. So how do you justify, what's he doing here? Okay? So the answer to your question is that is the essence of fanatics in Judaism, is that they often set aside halachot in order to do other actions, which are in fact a violation of halakha, in the name of halakha. And that's how you know that you're a fanatic. That's my point. You understand what I'm saying? When I decide that because Plony is doing the wrong thing, I'm going to beat him up, right? Guy goes up and takes his chair in shul and smashes it over the head of the guy because he didn't blow the shofar the way he thinks you should blow the shofar. So, we can laugh at these examples I'm giving because they're stupid. But the point is that in that case, clearly the guy is in a suspension of his halakhic judgment. And by the way, this very important thing you're saying now, which is that halakha is the thing that's supposed to stop us from being fanatics in many different ways. How do you know, for example, if, let's say you decide that you want to spend all day davening. You have the money and you can do it. And you're going to spend all day davening. And it all looks wonderful because nothing is wrong. But then what happens is one of your children calls up and says, I need help. Right? They ask you for help with something. And you say, I can't do it because I'm davening. I've already finished Shacharis 14 hours ago, and it's not yet time for Mincha, right? But I can't help you. I'm sorry. I can't help you because I have to daven more. I said, wait a minute. What are you doing? You're not helping your child who asks you for help because you're davening. So you're a fanatic. You've got the judgment wrong. Your obligation to help your child is much more important than you've already finished davening. You understand what I'm saying? You're saying Psalm number 273. So what are you doing? You now know that you're on the wrong course because the fulfillment of other mitzvot is being pushed off. So this is clearly the case of someone who kills somebody because he doesn't like the prime minister. How does he justify such an action? He can say whatever he wants, but the thing that should have stopped him is, wait, in order to get across my political views, I have to violate halakha. So I'm wrong.